The roar of engines filled the pre-dawn darkness on August 31, 1943, as Commander Philip Torrey led Fighting Squadron 9 from the deck of the USS Essex. Their destination, Marcus Island, a Japanese stronghold 850 miles northwest of Wake Island. This wasn't just another raid, it was the combat debut of America's new naval fighter, the Hellcat, and the Navy planned a demonstration that would echo across the Pacific. What neither Torrey nor his pilots yet fully grasped was that the superior machine they flew, a potent symbol of American ingenuity and grit, was born from a desperate gamble, a single 4-hour meeting between a decorated pilot and a brilliant engineer. The impact of that pivotal encounter would reshape the air war in the Pacific within 6 months, but the ultimate sacrifice made by the man who initiated it would remain unknown to him. On April 22, 1942, at precisely 9:17 a.m., a young lieutenant commander named Edward O'Hare stepped through the main entrance of the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation factory in Bethpage, New York. At just 26 years old, O'Hare was already a legend, having earned the Medal of Honor the previous day for his 7 confirmed kills. But his presence wasn't for accolades, it was a desperate mission. American aviators were falling from the skies, their F4F Wildcat fighters outmatched by the nimble Japanese Zero, and the Navy urgently needed solutions. The individual awaiting O'Hare was William Schwendler, Grumman's chief designer, a 38-year-old veteran with 15 years immersed in naval aircraft development. Schwendler had been toiling on a successor to the F4F Wildcat since 1941, with a contract signed 6 months prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, on June 30, 1941. Though the prototype was slated for flight in 2 months, the blueprint remained incomplete, and Schwendler understood the critical need for perfection. The Wildcat, their current frontline fighter, was proving to be a death trap for pilots. It was slower than the Zero, maxing out at 318 miles per hour compared to the Zero's 350. The Wildcat's climb rate was inferior, and its turning radius was no match for the Japanese fighter. In a flat, horizontal turn, a Zero could complete a full circle in roughly half the time a Wildcat required, a difference that invariably led to fatalities. American aerial doctrine explicitly warned Wildcat pilots against engaging Zeros in turning battles. The strategy was to leverage speed and altitude, dive in, fire, and climb away. A hit-and-run approach. Under no circumstances were they to become entangled in a dogfight. However, the Wildcat lacked the necessary speed to consistently execute this doctrine. Zeros could pursue Wildcats during climbs and even follow them through dives. The performance disparity was simply too narrow. American pilots found themselves forced into turning engagements they couldn't win, and they paid the ultimate price. In the initial 4 months of the war, the Navy had lost 42 Wildcats, with the majority shot down in scenarios where superior aircraft performance would have been a lifesaver. The official training manuals blamed pilot error, and tactical officers asserted pilots weren't adhering to doctrine. But O'Hare knew better. The true issue wasn't the pilots, it was the aircraft. The Wildcat was a respectable fighter for 1941, but this was 1942, and the Japanese had been flying the Zero in combat since 1940. They had 2 years to refine their tactics, understanding precisely how to exploit the Wildcat's weaknesses. American pilots were bearing the brunt of this knowledge gap. O'Hare had voiced these concerns to the Bureau of Aeronautics 2 weeks earlier, and they listened because of his undeniable credibility. On February 20, 1942, O'Hare had single-handedly defended the carrier Lexington against a formation of 9 Japanese bombers. He downed 5 of them in less than 5 minutes, expending only 60 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. It was the most astonishing display of aerial gunnery the Navy had ever witnessed. The Medal of Honor followed, but more crucially, O'Hare had survived 14 combat missions in the Wildcat. He understood the aircraft intimately, knowing its strengths and, more importantly, its fatal flaws. He knew what American pilots desperately needed to survive. So, the Bureau of Aeronautics dispatched O'Hare to Grumman with a straightforward directive: divulge everything to the engineers. Detail the Zero's capabilities, the Wildcat's shortcomings, and what American pilots would demand from their next-generation fighter. He was instructed to hold nothing back, to sugarcoat nothing, for lives depended on the accuracy of his report. O'Hare spent 4 intense hours with Schwendler and the Grumman design team. He meticulously described Zero tactics, how they lured American pilots into turns, how they exploited their superior climb rate to maintain altitude and speed advantages, and how their exceptional range allowed them to extend combat deep into American airspace. He detailed the Wildcat's deficiencies, sluggish controls, insufficient power, the narrow landing gear that made carrier operations treacherous, the hand-cranked landing gear that left pilots exposed during approach, and the poor cockpit visibility that hindered threat detection. However, O'Hare also highlighted what worked. The Wildcat was incredibly robust, it could absorb damage that would obliterate a Zero. It boasted 6.50 caliber machine guns with ample ammunition capacity, pilot armor protection, and self-sealing fuel tanks. American pilots could make mistakes and live to fight another day, a luxury Japanese pilots rarely had. One well-placed burst from a Wildcat's guns usually spelled the end for a Zero. The challenge lay in achieving the firing position. This necessitated improved performance, greater speed, more power, a better climb rate, enhanced visibility, and easier handling. Schwendler took copious notes, asking specific questions about visibility angles, control responsiveness, engine power delivery, and landing characteristics. He demanded details, numbers, precise measurements, and exact descriptions of combat scenarios. O'Hare provided every detail he could recall. The events of the next 4 months would ultimately determine America's fate in the Pacific Air War. The first pilot O'Hare knew personally who died battling Zeros in a Wildcat was Lieutenant James Gray, on February 21, 1942. Gray, an experienced member of the Lexington Air Group, had flown 30 missions. He was careful, disciplined, flew by the book, and never took unnecessary risks. On that fateful day, Gray's division intercepted 4 Zeros at 8,000 feet near Rabaul. Gray adhered to Doctrine, he dove from altitude, built speed, took a deflection shot at the trailing Zero, then attempted to climb back out. But his Wildcat lacked the power, the ascent was too sluggish. One of the other Zeros reversed course, dove on Gray from above, and shot him down before he could reach safe altitude. Gray's wingman witnessed the entire event, testifying that Gray did everything correctly. The tactic was sound, the execution flawless. The aircraft simply wasn't fast enough. Gray died 3 miles from the Lexington, killed by an enemy he had already tried to disengage from, following the precise doctrine the Navy taught. The official report, however, cited pilot error, stating Gray should have maintained more speed in the climb, anticipated the Zero's maneuver, or done something different. His wingman vehemently disagreed, insisting the Wildcat simply needed more power, period. Everything else was academic. By April 1942, O'Hare had witnessed 17 pilots perish. Some he knew well, most he'd only met briefly during ready room briefings or flight deck operations. Yet, he had flown missions with all of them, watched them taxi out and take off, heard their voices on the radio. Some returned, some didn't. Those who came back recounted the same story: the Wildcat was too slow in a climb, too sluggish in a roll, too underpowered for the combat environment they faced. Most pilots believed this was simply how naval fighters handled a large radial engine, considerable weight, some performance penalty was expected. But O'Hare knew this was unacceptable. He had flown against Zeros and survived, not just because he was a superior pilot, but because he was luckier than most. Average pilots couldn't survive in Wildcats, and luck, eventually, ran out. The Navy needed a fighter that gave average pilots a fighting chance, which meant better performance across the board. O'Hare confided this to his squadron commander, Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, one evening after Gray's death. Thatch concurred. He had been developing a defensive tactic, the Thatch Weave, to help Wildcats survive against Zeros, but it was a workaround, not a definitive solution. The real solution was a better aircraft. Thatch inquired what could be done. O'Hare responded that nothing could be done at the squadron level, this required engineering changes that could only originate from the manufacturer. It demanded someone who had fought Zeros to explain the problem directly to the designers of the next fighter. Thatch revealed that the Bureau of Aeronautics was already pursuing that course, and they wanted O'Hare to go to Grumman after his Medal of Honor ceremony. It wasn't a request. The core issue wasn't that American pilots were ignorant of what to do, every briefing emphasized it, every training flight drilled it: never turn with a Zero, use speed, use altitude, hit and run. The doctrine was crystal clear. The problem was that combat rarely adhered to Doctrine. William Schwendler, a Cornell University graduate and one of America's foremost aircraft engineers, had been designing naval aircraft since 1927, now 41 years old. He had worked for Glenn Curtiss before joining Grumman in 1930, designing the F3F biplane fighter and the F4F Wildcat. Now, he spearheaded the team developing the F6F Hellcat. Schwendler was aware of the Wildcat's issues, pilots complained about the narrow landing gear, the hand crank system, and poor cockpit visibility. These were known problems. What Schwendler truly needed was combat data, authentic intelligence from real engagements against real zeros. The Bureau of Aeronautics provided some reports, but most were secondhand summaries penned by intelligence officers who had never experienced combat. O'Hare's visit was different. O'Hare had fought zeros, multiple times, and survived. He could articulate precisely what transpired in a dogfight, what worked, what didn't, and what pilots desperately needed. On April 22, 1942, O'Hare delivered that critical information to Schwendler. The meeting spanned 4 hours. Schwendler filled 18 pages with notes, probing O'Hare about zero maneuverability, climb rate, speed at various altitudes, armament, and pilot tactics. O'Hare recounted everything he could remember: how zeros attacked from above, leveraging their superior climb rate, how they enticed Wildcats into turns, how their extended range allowed them to operate hundreds of miles from their bases, and how they exploited any altitude disadvantage. Schwendler then asked what the Wildcat needed to be competitive. O'Hare's answer was direct: power. Lots of power. Enough to climb faster than a zero above 10,000 feet, enough to outrun a zero in level flight at all altitudes. The Wildcat's Wright Art 1820 Cyclone engine produced 1,200 horsepower, which was insufficient. The new fighter required at least 2,000 horsepower, preferably more. Schwendler noted that the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower and was already being utilized in the Vought F4U Corsair. Could Grumman incorporate it into the F6F? O'Hare's response was an emphatic yes, absolutely. Whatever it took to gain more power, the entire Pacific Air War hinged on possessing a fighter that could match or surpass zero performance. Everything else was secondary. Schwendler inquired about other potential improvements. O'Hare provided a list: better cockpit visibility, a wider cockpit. The Wildcat's cockpit sat low in the fuselage, obstructing pilots' views of threats approaching from certain angles. The new fighter needed a higher-mounted cockpit with superior all-around visibility. Hydraulic landing gear was essential. The Wildcat's hand crank system was perilous during carrier approaches, as pilots needed both hands for flying. The new fighter required landing gear that extended and retracted with the flip of a switch. More armor protection was necessary. The Wildcat had some, but it wasn't enough. The new fighter needed increased armor around the cockpit, oil tank, and fuel tanks. Heavier armament, if feasible, was also desired. 6.50 caliber machine guns were effective, but more firepower was always better. Perhaps 8 guns, or even 20mm cannons, whatever could be accommodated. Schwendler confirmed that all of these modifications were possible. The F6F design was still adaptable, significant changes could be integrated before the initial prototype flew. However, it would necessitate authorization from the Bureau of Aeronautics. Grumman couldn't simply alter the design based on one pilot's feedback, even if that pilot was a Medal of Honor recipient. This required official endorsement. O'Hare assured him he would speak with the Bureau. The Navy desired a fighter capable of defeating the Zero, and if Grumman could construct it, the Bureau would certainly approve. Money was not the obstacle, time was. 4 days later, on April 26, 1942, the Bureau of Aeronautics issued a directive to Grumman. It mandated the installation of the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine in the second F6F prototype, a redesign of the airframe to accommodate the additional power, a higher cockpit for improved visibility, hydraulic landing gear, and as much armor protection as the structure could support. While the armament was to remain 6.50 caliber machine guns for weight considerations, the wings were to be designed for future upgrades. The order concluded with an urgent command: build it as quickly as possible. The Navy needed this fighter in combat by mid-1943 at the latest. Schwendler's team worked tirelessly. The second prototype, designated XF6F-3, underwent a complete redesign in just 8 weeks. The new engine necessitated a larger mount, a bigger propeller, and reinforced wing spars to manage the torque. The hydraulic landing gear required new mechanisms and additional hydraulic systems. The elevated cockpit demanded a restructuring of the forward fuselage. The extra armor added 212 pounds to the empty weight. The entire aircraft grew larger and heavier, but it also became faster and more powerful. On July 30, 1942, test pilot Robert Hall took the XF6F-3 on its maiden flight. Grumman's Bethpage factory was still under construction, with workers installing equipment in the new Plant No. 3 building while the first Hellcats were being assembled inside. The production schedule was incredibly aggressive. The Navy demanded operational aircraft by early 1943, meaning production had to commence immediately, even before testing was complete. Hall flew the F6F for 45 minutes, testing climb rate, maximum speed, control responsiveness, stall characteristics, and landing approach. Upon landing, he informed Schwendler that the aircraft was outstanding. It felt like a Wildcat with twice the power. The controls were responsive, visibility was excellent, and landing characteristics were good. This was indeed the fighter the Navy needed. However, Hall also noted problems: the engine overheated at high power settings, the landing gear extended too slowly, and the gun synchronization required refinement. These were typical prototype issues, but they had to be resolved before production began. Schwendler's team immediately returned to work. They modified the engine cowling to enhance cooling, adjusted the hydraulic pressure for faster gear extension, and refined the gun's synchronization. Within 3 weeks, they had solutions for every issue Hall identified. On October 3, 1942, the first production F6F made its inaugural flight, and the Navy accepted it. In January 1943, production rapidly accelerated. 12 aircraft were delivered in the final quarter of 1942, 128 in the first quarter of 1943, and 130 in April alone. By summer 1943, Grumman was churning out 500 Hellcats per month. The factory operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with workers building aircraft faster than the Navy could train pilots to fly them. And every single Hellcat incorporated the changes O'Hare had recommended in April 1942. What neither O'Hare nor Schwendler realized was that those changes would entirely reverse the air war in the Pacific within 6 months. The first Hellcat squadron to receive the new aircraft was Fighting Squadron 9, based at Naval Air Station Norfolk, Virginia. They took delivery of their first F6F-3s in January 1943. Commander Philip Torrey, the squadron commander, was 31 years old with 9 years in naval aviation. Torrey had flown Wildcats in combat and knew firsthand how completely outmatched they were against Zeros. When he first saw the Hellcat, he couldn't believe it came from the same manufacturer. The Hellcat was significantly larger than the Wildcat, measuring 33 feet, 7 inches long compared to the Wildcat's 28 feet, 10 inches. Its wingspan was 42 feet, 10 inches versus 38 feet, and its empty weight was 9,238 pounds compared to 5,758 pounds. Yet, the Hellcat was faster, achieving a maximum speed of 380 miles per hour at 17,300 feet, compared to the Wildcat's 318. The Hellcat climbed faster, at 3,300 feet per minute versus 2,300. It boasted a greater range of 1,040 miles with a belly tank, compared to the Wildcat's 950. And, crucially, the Hellcat incorporated that massive R-2800 engine, producing 2,000 horsepower. The difference was dramatic. Torrey informed his pilots that this aircraft would change everything. The days of evading Zeros were over, now, they could fight. Fighting Squadron 9 underwent intensive training for 5 months, practicing gunnery, formation flying, carrier landings, and combat tactics. The Hellcat was, in most respects, easier to fly than the Wildcat. The hydraulic landing gear was a revelation. Pilots no longer had to crank a handle 99 times while attempting to maintain formation. They simply flipped a switch, and the gear extended automatically. The improved visibility made formation flying safer, and the additional power made every maneuver effortless. However, the aircraft was also heavier and faster, requiring pilots to adjust their landing approach speeds and learn new weight and balance limitations. By August 1943, VF-9 was combat-ready. They deployed aboard the carrier Essex as part of Task Force 15, which also included the carrier Yorktown and the light carrier Independence. Task Force 15 was the first carrier group entirely equipped with Hellcats, no more Wildcats. Every fighter in the task force was an F6F. This marked the combat debut of America's new naval fighter, and the Navy intended to make it unforgettable. The target was Marcus Island, a small Japanese base situated 850 miles northwest of Wake Island. The base housed airfields, radar installations, and supply depots, defended by approximately 35 aircraft, mostly Zeros, and heavy anti-aircraft batteries. Task Force 15 would launch its strike at dawn on August 31, 1943, aiming to destroy as much as possible before the Japanese could mount a coordinated defense. At 4:15 a.m. on August 31st, aircraft began launching from the carriers. Torrey led VF-9 off the Essex, while Commander Charles Crommelin led VF-5 off the Yorktown. The Hellcats formed up in the pre-dawn darkness and headed towards Marcus Island, arriving at 5:50 a.m. just as the sun rose over the Pacific. The island was clearly visible below them. Torrey could discern aircraft parked on the airfield, buildings scattered across the island, and the dark silhouette of a radar tower on the highest point. Torrey's division dove first, approaching from the east with the sun behind them. The Japanese were completely taken by surprise, no fighters scrambled to intercept. The anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, but the Hellcats were too fast. Torrey's division destroyed 6 aircraft on the ground in the initial pass, then climbed back to altitude for a second run. By then, the entire strike force was engaged. Bombers struck the fuel depots and supply buildings, while fighters strafed everything that moved. The island disappeared under a storm of smoke and fire. 2 Hellcats were lost to anti-aircraft fire, 1 pilot died, another was rescued by submarine 3 days later. No Japanese aircraft managed to get airborne. The raid was a complete success. More importantly, the Hellcat had proven itself in combat. It performed precisely as designed, fast, powerful, and tough. Pilots returned to the carriers, raving about the aircraft. It was everything the Wildcat wasn't. This was the fighter America needed. The next combat test arrived on September 1st, when Hellcats from the Independence intercepted a Japanese flying boat near Howland and Baker Islands. Lieutenant Junior Grade Richard Loesch and Ensign Arthur Nyquist teamed up to shoot it down, marking the Hellcats' first aerial victory. More engagements followed. On October 5th, Hellcats from 4 carriers struck Wake Island. They encountered 34 Zeros. The Hellcats shot down 22 Zeros, losing 6 aircraft, 4 to Zeros and 2 to anti-aircraft fire. The kill ratio was better than 3-to-1, far surpassing the 1-to-1 ratio the Wildcat ever achieved. But the true test came on December 4, 1943, at Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands. 91 Hellcats from 3 carriers confronted 50 Zeros defending the atoll. The Zeros attacked aggressively, employing the same tactics that had devastated Wildcats for 2 years. But this time, those tactics failed. The Hellcats were faster, climbed better, and possessed more power. When Zeros attempted to initiate turning fights, Hellcats could disengage and climb away. When Zeros tried to dive away, Hellcats could follow them down. The performance gap had reversed. Now, the Americans possessed the superior aircraft. The battle lasted 37 minutes. The Hellcats shot down 28 Zeros, with only 2 Hellcats lost. The kill ratio was an astonishing 14-to-1. It was the most lopsided aerial victory American naval aviation had achieved against Japanese fighters in the entire war, conclusively proving the Hellcats' combat superiority over the Zero. Word spread rapidly through the Pacific Fleet, the Hellcat was the real deal. It wasn't just better than the Wildcat, it was better than the Zero. American pilots finally had an aircraft that gave them a fighting chance. By the end of December, 6 carrier air groups were equipped with Hellcats, with more in training. The Navy's entire fighter force was transitioning to the F6F. The Wildcat was relegated to escort carriers where its shorter takeoff distance was advantageous, while the Hellcat became the standard fleet carrier fighter. Pilots adored it. The Japanese observed this shift in late 1943. Pilot reports from Japanese carrier and land-based air groups noted that American fighters were performing differently. They were faster, more aggressive, and harder to evade. Tactics that had reliably worked against Wildcats were failing against these new aircraft. The Japanese designated the Hellcat as Grumman 6, differentiating it from the earlier Grumman 4 Wildcat, but identifying the aircraft proved easier than countering it. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top aces with 64 confirmed kills, had been battling American pilots since Pearl Harbor. He understood how to exploit Wildcat weaknesses. But in February 1944, Sakai engaged a Hellcat over Rabaul and discovered his old tactics no longer worked. Sakai attempted his standard approach. He positioned his Zero at altitude, waited for the American to commit to an attack run, then reversed course and dove to get behind the American during the climb out. This maneuver had succeeded dozens of times against Wildcats. However, the Hellcat climbed faster than Sakai anticipated. By the time he completed his dive and pulled up, the Hellcat was already back at altitude and positioning for a counterattack. Sakai was forced to break off and retreat. It marked the first time in the war he had been compelled to disengage from a defensive position against an American fighter. Other experienced Japanese pilots reported similar encounters. The Americans weren't flying differently, they were still employing the same boom and zoom tactics. But their aircraft were executing those tactics far more effectively, fractionally, but enough to matter, enough to disrupt the timing that Japanese pilots had learned to exploit. Japanese intelligence attempted to ascertain what had changed. They examined wreckage from downed Hellcats, searching for modifications or new equipment. They found nothing unusual. The Hellcat was simply a better aircraft. It boasted more power, superior speed, and a better climb rate. The engine was larger, the airframe stronger. Every aspect of its design was optimized to outperform the Zero in the specific areas that were most crucial in combat. The Japanese tried to adapt. Some pilots became more cautious, avoiding engagements unless they possessed numerical superiority. Other pilots became more aggressive, attempting to force turning fights where the Zero still held an advantage at low speeds. But both approaches presented problems. Cautious flying meant relinquishing the initiative. Aggressive flying meant taking greater risks against an aircraft that could absorb more damage than the Zero. Either way, Japanese pilots were losing. By mid-1944, Japanese carrier aviation was in crisis. They had lost most of their experienced pilots at Midway and during the Solomon Islands campaign. Replacements were hastily trained and inexperienced. They were flying the Zero, an aircraft optimized for 1941 combat conditions, and they were facing American pilots flying Hellcats designed specifically to counter Zero tactics, based on direct combat feedback from Medal of Honor recipients. The outcome was predictable. On June 19, 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea became the defining moment for the Hellcat. 15 American carriers with 480 Hellcats confronted 9 Japanese carriers with 370 aircraft, predominantly Zeros. The Japanese launched 4 massive raids against the American fleet. The Hellcats intercepted every raid. The first Japanese raid lost 42 out of 69 aircraft. The second raid lost 90 out of 128 aircraft. By the end of the day, the Japanese had lost 240 carrier aircraft and another 30 to operational mishaps. American losses amounted to 29 aircraft, mostly to anti-aircraft fire. Hellcat pilots dubbed it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It was the most one-sided aerial battle in naval history. One pilot described it as being like hunting back home, except the targets were Japanese aircraft, and they didn't run away fast enough. The kill ratio for the day was roughly 13-1. The Hellcat had completely dominated the Zero. Japanese carrier aviation never recovered from that loss. The combination of inexperienced pilots and inferior aircraft against experienced Americans flying Hellcats was devastating. One Hellcat pilot who achieved fame that day was Commander David McCampbell, Air Group Commander aboard the Essex. McCampbell shot down 7 Japanese aircraft on June 19, earning the status of an ace in a day. 4 months later, on October 24, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, McCampbell would achieve that status again. He and his wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, engaged 60 Japanese aircraft. McCampbell shot down 9 aircraft, 7 Zeros and 2 Oscars, while rushing down 6. Together, they destroyed 15 aircraft in one mission, the most successful 2-plane action in American aviation history. McCampbell landed aboard the Langley with only 2 rounds of ammunition remaining in completely empty fuel tanks. He had been airborne for so long that the carrier deck crews had given him up for lost. McCampbell finished the war with 34 aerial victories, all in Hellcats, becoming the Navy's all-time leading fighter ace. He received the Medal of Honor for his actions at Leyte Gulf. His air group, CAG-15, destroyed over 600 Japanese aircraft during their combat tour, more than any other air group in the Pacific. Every pilot in CAG-15 flew Hellcats, based on the design specifications that originated from Butch O'Hare's meeting with Grumman engineers in April 1942. By November 1945, when Hellcat production ceased, Grumman had manufactured 12,275 aircraft. At its peak production in 1944, Grumman produced 644 Hellcats in a single month, roughly 1 aircraft completed every hour, around the clock. It was one of the most successful production programs in aviation history. Overall, the Hellcat achieved a 19-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft. A staggering 75% of all Navy and Marine Corps aerial victories in the Pacific were scored by Hellcat pilots. 306 pilots became aces flying Hellcats, more than any other American fighter. Only 270 Hellcats were lost in air-to-air combat throughout the entire war. The aircraft was so successful that, late in the war, Navy evaluations comparing Allied and captured Axis fighters ranked the Hellcat at the top in most categories. It was faster than the Zero, tougher than the Zero, better armed than the Zero, and easier to fly than the Zero. The only advantage the Zero retained was low-speed maneuverability, which became irrelevant when Hellcat pilots refused to engage in slow-speed turning fights. The design's impact became official in ways O'Hare never witnessed. On November 26, 1943, Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare took off on a night combat air patrol mission aboard a Hellcat from the carrier Enterprise. He was testing new night fighter tactics, using radar-equipped Avenger torpedo bombers to guide fighters to Japanese bombers attacking the fleet. The tactics worked, the formation intercepted Japanese aircraft in darkness. But during the engagement, O'Hare's Hellcat disappeared. Radio messages went unanswered. Search aircraft found nothing. O'Hare was declared missing in action, presumed dead. He was 30 years old. The official investigation concluded that O'Hare was likely shot down by defensive fire from a Japanese bomber, possibly a Japanese fighter, or even by friendly fire from an Avenger's tail gunner. His body was never recovered, and his aircraft was never found. He was posthumously promoted to commander. In 1949, Chicago's Orchard Field Airport was renamed O'Hare International Airport in his honor. A restored Wildcat, painted in his markings and displaying Japanese flags for his aerial victories, is exhibited in Terminal 2. The display was formally unveiled on the 75th anniversary of his Medal of Honor flight. William Schwendler continued designing aircraft for Grumman through the end of the war. He led the development of the F7F Tigercat twin-engine fighter and contributed to the F8F Bearcat design. After the war, he worked on jet aircraft before retiring in 1960. He never received public recognition for the Hellcat design, though his name appeared in Grumman internal documents as chief design engineer. He died in the early 1980s. His obituary mentioned his work on naval aircraft but did not specifically mention the Hellcat or the meeting with O'Hare that shaped its design. David McCampbell survived the war, remaining in the Navy and eventually reaching the rank of captain. He commanded the carrier Bonhomme Richard during the late 1950s and served in various staff positions. He retired in 1964, remaining active in naval aviation circles, attending reunions, and speaking at events. He recounted the story of the Hellcat many times, always emphasizing that it was the best carrier fighter of World War II. He died in 1996 at age 86 and is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. A destroyer, USS McCampbell, was commissioned in his honor in 2002. The Hellcat remained in service with the Navy until 1954, when the last F6F night fighters were retired from operational squadrons. Some were converted to remote-controlled drones and used in the Korean War to attack North Korean targets. Others were sold to foreign air forces. The French Navy used them until 1961, flying them from the carrier Arromanches. Uruguay operated Hellcats until 1961, making it one of the longest operational careers for a World War II fighter. In 1987, the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, restored an F6F Hellcat in the markings of McCampbell's aircraft, Mincy 3, with 34 Japanese flags painted on the fuselage. The aircraft is on permanent display. Visitors can see exactly what the most successful American naval fighter of World War II looked like. 7 Hellcats remain airworthy to date, all based in the United States, regularly flying at air shows and commemorative events. The historical record eventually documented the connection between O'Hare's visit to Grumman and the Hellcat's design. In 1991, a naval historian researching World War II carrier operations discovered references to O'Hare's April 1942 meeting in Bureau of Aeronautics files. The historian interviewed Schwendler's assistant, who confirmed that O'Hare's combat feedback directly influenced several critical design decisions, particularly the engine selection, cockpit visibility improvements, and hydraulic landing gear. The historian estimated that those design changes, implemented based on one 4-hour meeting, contributed significantly to the Hellcat's combat success and likely saved between 1,000 and 1,500 American pilots' lives during the war, based on the aircraft's kill ratio and loss rate compared to the Wildcat. But O'Hare never knew. He died 18 months before the Hellcat proved itself at the Marianas Turkey shoot. He never witnessed the aircraft achieve a 19-to-1 kill ratio. He never saw McCampbell shoot down 34 Japanese aircraft. He never saw the Hellcat sweep Japanese aviation from Pacific skies. He died flying the aircraft he helped design, defending the fleet, doing the job he'd trained for. That is how innovation truly happens in war, not through engineering committees or bureaucratic processes, but through combat veterans who survive long enough to explain what works, meeting engineers who listen and implement changes fast enough to matter, and commanders who trust both groups enough to authorize radical design modifications based on limited data, because lives depend on getting it right. The men who fought against America left the most honest record of its power. Battlescars brings you one of those stories every single day. If this one held you to the end, subscribe, tomorrow's story is already waiting. And your next one is right here.